Yeah, gaming is not as bad as some politicians would like you to believe.
No, it's always been Tipper Gore was wrong. It's never, is Tipper Gore the one who was like obsessed with video games or ruining our children's brains? And it's like, no, it's the PG-13 movie that isn't allowed to say fuck, but it can show
Oh yeah.
just horrible violence to children. Like the things that you're worried about are incorrect.
Yeah.
No one's, yeah, that's not the cause of our problems.
Let's put it this way. I've shot an incredible number of things in video games, and I'm no closer today to going out and committing a random act of violence in
Right.
society for playing those
Right.
video games. Though there was one night was kind of worrying to me when I played GTA for the first time in virtual reality. Man, that was an interesting night.
I bet that's, well, so first of all, how is GTA modified to become first person?
So there was a mod by a gentleman, and then it's in first person. So it's everything. You're in GTA, and it's like you're in downtown LA. And I think I killed about 4,000 people that night.
Yeah, that's not great.
Yeah, it's not
It's
great.
much better when it's bugs and little alien Halo enemies running around. That's fine. It gets rough when it's like I really enjoy the game Just Cause. Just Cause is really fun to just go around an open world. Just Cause, I think 2 or 3 had just like the perfect balance of you get in a helicopter and just fire off missiles. But I don't it is rough when you're killing other people. It's much better when it's robots and aliens, and yeah, those types of games like I need a bow and arrow, and when I pull the bow, the game slows down for me so that my really terrible ability to play video games lets me aim up the shot that I need. Like I need the game to recognize I'm not a good gamer and still make it fun for me. And all of those military ones are like, "Oh no, the Nazi shot you in the head. You're dead." And I'm like, "Well, okay, but come on." Like
Yeah, I don't know, but that's not how I play games. It'll be interesting when we play
yeah.
Helldivers 2 together.
This is what I'm saying is I'm worried. Like I am a Breath of the Wild, Horizon Zero Dawn. Like I'm a bow and arrow girl.
I'm feeling like I'm gonna be thinking to myself like I'm being overwhelmed in battle. I survive, and then I find your decrepit corpse behind a rock somewhere.
Exactly. I was trying to line up the one shot and
Yeah.
then just got killed by bugs. Welcome to Acceptance Criteria, where we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of how software gets made and how we can all do a better job together. My name is Kevin Thomas Euland, and across the chat from me is Andrew Greener. Say hi, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew. We're also here to get deeper on the human element. I could go on for an eternity about people and how they think about the process of building complex systems. And I can't think of two better people to do that than Kevin and I.
Except this week, there's still 3 of us. We're once again joined by David Scripka, a data scientist I used to work with. Say hi, David.
Hi, David.
This is the second part of our 2-part episode talking with David about all things data science, machine learning, and AI. Take a listen to last week's episode to hear us go through a crash course on Data Science 101, from how machine learning models work to the types of things a data scientist does. We also dug into the crazy fast evolution of the large language models like ChatGPT and what it might mean for the future of some of the types of machine learning we do today. On this week's episode, we'll dig into how that evolving landscape means more and more people will have the opportunity to work with these data science models, how that is going to require even closer partnership between data science, engineering, and product management, and of course, Andrew waxes poetic about his post-scarcity AI utopia. But first, a friendly reminder that we're always interested in hearing questions directly from you, our listeners, for our segment User Stories. If you've got a scenario you'd like help with, whether it's working with an engineering or product team member, trying to figure out how to solve an agile process problem, or you just can't understand why your favorite app updated everything and it's now terrible, we're here to talk it through with you. You can send those questions to acceptancepod@gmail.com or submit them on the Discord and the User Stories channel, and we might be able to help on a future episode. And we're happy to keep it anonymous so no one can trace it back to you if you end up talking a coworker or something. But before we get to all of that, let's take a short break and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. This is a segment we like to call Personas, where we talk about the types of roles you'll encounter in the software development world and how those roles work best and you can work with them more effectively. So today we'll continue to dig into the role of the data scientist.
Part of my question for you, David, is I feel like there was rightly so, there was almost like this elite characteristics about machine learning in the past, and I feel like a lot of companies now are sort of saying, here's the tools, here's the LLMs, there you go, your data engineer can get in there, and companies are not necessarily investing in in people coming out of data science, machine learning, AI background. Does that concern you that we're able to now send somebody who's a stockbroker to milk a cow basically and pretend to be a farmer and get logic out of this data?
It's a really interesting question. I know I keep saying that, but it honestly is. And I think this is where it's actually a good connection to some of the other topics that I think come up a lot. And there's a more fundamental question: are some of these issues, are they technical issues, or are they marketing issues, or organizational structure issues, or product market fit issues? And who's the best person to be making that decision? Just because you can have a data scientist or someone who's not a data scientist go in and using the model, are they the best position to be doing that for a given application? In general, I think it is good that more people can use the models directly, right? It's just easier to get in and try things and experiment. On average, I think that's probably good, but that assumes, you have a nice, well-functioning org structure, you have proper controls in place that kind of manage how all this is being done, but then ultimately, exposed as products or put out there in some other way.
I am curious that gets to like what is the question you're asking, right? So like if it's a question that the AI, like a large language model, is going to help you answer, then it probably is less important to have the statistical background that you would have wanted somebody to have even 5 years ago, versus if it's a sales financial, like we're using a statistical model, and sure, Salesforce has got a bunch of models now built in for you automatically, but that is a business question, but there still probably needs to be some kind of background to appreciate the difference between why percentage X is not the real thing because you didn't ask the right question. There is probably still a background, versus if you are trying to run through, the model is now reading all of our tech support tickets and the person needs to figure out what's going on in the business. That could be a product manager, that could be a business analyst who without the statistical background. So it feels like there's paths that open up in a way that probably can be that broad, but then maybe should still be fairly narrow in some cases, and the answer can't be a blanket, ooh, we have
Yeah.
these AI models now, anyone can do it. It's like, well, no, maybe anyone can do it, but still understand why you would want to put the person with I don't know, it depends on the question, it feels like.
Yeah.
I feel like we're humans and that doesn't matter to a lot of businesses, which scares me without the regulatory bodies, right? Because, and you know me, I'm not, Kevin will tell you, I'm hell-bent on the 110 mile an hour version.
Right.
But I look at it like some of the technologies, like when Mongo came along, people were like, hey, I tried to write data to Mongo and it didn't reject it. So that's good. We're all set. We don't need a relational model because Mongo just accepts anything. And I feel like the minute they get results out of these LLMs inside of, the snowflakes and the other technologies in the world, they're going to be happy. So a couple of questions then is how are these companies, or is it required to have a machine learning guy to check the data quality?
Kevin from the future here, just popping in to point out to new listeners, when Andrew says guy, he doesn't mean it in a gendered way, he's just using it in its more generic, hey you guys way. Both of us would agree that anyone can be good in all of the roles that we talk about on this podcast. All right, back to the episode.
And then how do you even go about assessing the quality of the results that you're getting out of these models?
I think Kevin put it well earlier, right? It really depends on the problem, on the task you're asking the model to do. And so right now it is at a very strange state. So I'm sure you've heard the term prompt engineer, right? People who are just
Yes.
trying to
Yeah.
figure out how to talk to the models. That's becoming less of a concern, I think, but it's not gone. And so, when I'm working with the models day to day, there is a part of it of you just have to know, like, oh, this is how you should talk to the model. If you write a prompt this way, you'll get a good result, but if you write it this way, you won't, right? Some of that is arcane, and there aren't good reasons for why it works well for some models and doesn't for others. I think that is still evolving. But then there's another aspect of it where, if I'm trying to write a model to do some analysis on some text data, oftentimes halfway through, I'll realize I don't understand the business process here. Right? I don't understand the history of this data, what it was trying to capture and what it's going to be used for. And without that knowledge, I can't properly, get an answer. So maybe I can technically write the prompt in a more efficient way, but actually for that particular use case, I need someone who has a much better understanding of the business process and history.
Yeah, it'd be interesting too do you think, or are we already seeing it in your day to day models that help you build a better prompt where you're saying, hey, I think I need this, and the model's coming back and saying, actually, you really want this?
Yes, that's starting to happen.
It is. Ah, we're so there.
It's the more expensive models, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
But yeah,
It's going to be an amazing, and I say amazing, not necessarily in a positive light. I don't want you to think I'm super excited about charging headlong in the future, but it is going to be awe-inspiring to see.
Well, and do we see, like, from a career perspective, I think one of the things people sort of correctly, it's sometimes it's unfair, sometimes it's a little classist, sometimes it's a little racist. There has been sort of over the last 20 years, oh, go learn programming has been the answer to the steel worker who has lost their job, right? And so, like, there's a flood of engineers who took the, the 1 year, 2 year course, and they can write you some basic capabilities. And in a lot of massive corporations that had intranet applications, you needed the person who could write you the ASPX page, and that was fine, and you didn't really care about the super quality of it. But then you run into those folks landing in a startup, trying to build a brand new software platform, and you quickly realize, like, this is the person who, it's not criticism of them, they just haven't had the right level of experience, and they are an engineer, but it feels bad to call them like a different level of engineer, but that does happen, right? And so it's interesting looking at data science. It does feel like there is a part of the world which is great. This is all low code, no code, drag and drop. You can go and learn and do all of this stuff. And depending on the question, it might be totally great that the steel worker now takes the whatever certification and can go and be productive using those tools. But I do wonder, there still does seem to be a significant part of the market would be beneficial to the person who understands the underlying statistics, who understands the underlying math. There is still going to be, how long do we think that's the case? Do we think the large language models are going to replace the statistical models at some point and incorporate that as well, and eventually you don't even need that? I don't know. I'm curious how long we can still have this sort of split.
yeah. I think a lot of it depends on not only the pace of continued development, right? Because of course there's multiple, well, infinitely many scenarios here, and we don't know how it's going to
Right.
happen. But it could just keep going, faster and faster, and we're all just along for the ride. Or eventually it will get extremely expensive. There will be less clear, paths to monetization and actual profit. And then all of a sudden, these companies won't be interested in training the $200 billion version of the model, and we'll kind of slow down. But even if we stopped today, we haven't even begun to fully explore the potential of the models and the implications on what that means for people actually using them and doing the work. So I'm in the fairly privileged position of having that experience, building that foundation. And so when I use the models, it's great, right? I did SQL work years and years ago. I'm not good at it. When I need to write a complex query, I throw it to ChatGPT. If it doesn't work, I throw it to the more expensive version of ChatGPT, and it usually works. And that's faster for me. And I can look at it, and kind of understand, and it's mostly doing the right thing, but I'm not 100% sure. It's convenient for me to use, and it doesn't have an impact too much on my other work. But that isn't true for other people.
Right.
And yeah, I can't speak for their experience, right? Because I don't know what that's going to be like. But
Greener, you were making faces earlier because you do believe that ChatGPT 5 and then 6 and then 7 and then 8 will be continuous exponential increase. And I think some people are wondering that the power consumption, cost, and possibly we are hitting walls with ChatGPT 5 doesn't seem to be exponentially better the same way 4 was better than 3.
Yeah, I guess my challenge is I wonder if a lot of the challenges we're gonna have to overcome will be solved partially with the help of machine learning. That's my hope, right? So I'm curious whether like some of those real problems exist, like power issues and stuff like that. I just dream of a day where AI is coming back and telling us like, what are you worried about? There's a blocker, we'll remove it for you. And I'm a dreamer, obviously, but I don't see I don't see a time when the benefit of this runs out. My biggest worry with that is, do we see the first global class sort of caste system open up, which is there's people who are just getting left behind because you now have these supercharged people, and then you have these people who don't have access to this type of augmented, intelligence, right?
Well, and I worry about the other direction, which is, okay, great. Now a bunch of people can go and be, it's technically good in the short term. You have a bunch of people who don't need to have the background, who can go and be contributing members of companies who can use these low code, no code models. But then I worry about like who watches the watchers, who is is the extreme class of machine learning engineers who are now the privileged 10,000 who are the only ones who understand how any of these models work. Aren't we going to get stuck in the other direction? Doesn't David become the elite guy who did have the background and knows what he's dealing with in a way that the random next person doesn't? That person just knows the low code and gets the answers that the machine gives them, and David's the one who's now in control of whether or not that answer that machine gives them is good or bad.
At some point, I hope it's during our lifetimes, when the AI comes for you and puts you in an orange jumpsuit, Kevin, for all the things you said, which is interesting, actually. It's a terrible thought. It's a terrible thing to say, but
that is why I say thank you to Alexa whenever she does something for me. So just in case they're keeping track of it, they know that I was nice to the robots.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting to see. I'm super excited. I mean, I got to be honest. I didn't think it was going to go so fast. People sort of said, hey, when it goes, it's going to get exponentially better from what you're used to, that linear sort of growth in technology. But it feels like the last 5 years, you must be excited by the last 5 years, right?
It's very exciting to be in it, yes, and probably in a similar thing you said before, exciting in a true sense of the word, right?
Yeah.
Not always in a good way.
Sometimes the drop in your stomach on the roller coaster is also because your body knows to warn you about you're falling off a cliff.
Yeah, and in so many ways, right? Like in some ways, the reason it's not moving faster is just cost.
Yeah.
There are things that I would like to do that we absolutely could do from our testing if we use GPT-4 and Gemini Ultra and the latest Anthropic model. We could do really, really powerful stuff with that, but it doesn't make financial sense. The models are too expensive, right? So we have to do smaller things with the cheaper models, but that's only until the next version comes out and the price of the current best gets cheaper.
Do you tend to stay within the confines of your industry, David, or are you constantly dreaming about new applications of it and getting excited and saying, hey, we might only be 5 years away from being able to do things like this? And then if there's any that jump out at you, what would they be?
Yeah, so I do try to stay, tracking all the developments that are happening. My day-to-day is in one particular industry, but it does touch in a lot of different places. And I do some open source software development on the side. So I try to stay connected to other areas. I do think one area that will start to have more applications, but we just haven't seen them yet, is things like audio and video, right? So some of the latest models can start to handle that. And so in the Gemini demos from Google, whether those were real or not, it might just be a matter of time. But now you're getting into things when you're thinking about speech. For example, there's one framing, you mentioned it earlier, Kevin, where speech is just text, right? You just need to put it through some transcription system and then you do all your stuff with text, but it's not, right? There's pacing and tempo and emotion behind the speech and pronunciation and accents and all these other factors. And with some of the demos that they've shown, and now since you can actually use this in the API, you can feed in the raw audio, right? So you can do whole other applications based off of working directly with the audio, similar with video, right? So we're bringing in all these other modalities and also just the continuing expansion of the capabilities of the models, right? So one of the examples with Gemini is they have this thing called a context window. It's basically just how much information can you shove in at one time into the model and get an answer. Windows here are getting very large. Gemini is up to 1 million tokens, right? Several books worth of information. So now you can put in entire videos, you can put in hours of recording. They put in basically, as one example, an entire textbook of a very low resource language, and the model at the end of that did a pretty good job at translating that language into English. So there are more and more applications as you expand the modalities, as you expand these capabilities, where I'm trying to think to the original question. Sorry, this is a long answer of, what implications does that have? What does that enable? And I don't really know yet. And I'm not sure anyone does, right? Because it's new.
Let me ask you this one, because just from thinking about what you were talking about, I can get a little sci-fi and say, do I need to learn Mandarin in the future, or am I just, are we just translating each other's languages, and does it matter, right? Is the barrier gone?
It seems like that barrier is getting lower and lower. I speak one language, even that not particularly well, so I can't really make a full determination here, but it certainly seems like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing that's going to be weird is, I think I've seen instances, maybe it was Google, where they were live listening to the language and doing the translation into your earbud, which would be very cool. I do wonder that that's one of those things where how much are a bunch of guys in Silicon Valley Valley accounting for your likelihood to encounter the same type of Cantonese when you're closer to Hong Kong than when you're closer to the Mandarin that they're going to speak in Beijing. And like Italy is actually, there's no such thing as Italian. There's 400 dialects because of the way Italy fractured in the Middle Ages, and they technically have an Italian language as a like state language, but there really isn't. So like all of those little details does feel like there's going to be just a ton of localization that needs to happen. And I do wonder that the more this becomes drag and drop, low code, no code, some little startup in Italy gets to go and spend a year talking to a bunch of people in all of the local dialects. And now you get that company is the one who figures out how to make you truly have the universal translator for your trip to Italy.
That's a great point, and that's from the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago, Kevin, where I said, "Hey, I've refined my thinking around AI taking all of our jobs, and I can sort of see a future where there are new jobs coming from the whole movement, right?" And actually, what you just said is a perfect example. And I know I'm a Matrix guy. For all our listeners, everybody knows I bring it back to the Matrix. When I think of the Matrix, I always think about those little applications that were sort of dotting around by the third movie, right? Where it's like there's this one sort of specific application in the Matrix that does blah. And that's kind of how I think about the AI is like you are going to have like these little random companies popping up saying, hey, we got this model. And then there's this real niche problem because it is a locale problem, right? Like there's all these dialects, and that's the one specific thing we're going to focus on is like just fixing all of these dialect problems. So that's a perfect example that you just gave of where I could see jobs getting created from the AI movement, right? Going 110 miles an hour.
Yeah, doesn't need to go 110. I do think so, David. In one of your notes, you were talking about is generative AI replacing the need for those traditional machine learning models, and I am sort of curious. It seems like the answer is yes, and yet there was that weird thing where one of the models just started speaking Spanish for 3 days, and for a while, ChatGPT was just ChatGPT. I don't know if it still makes up legal precedents, so those lawyers got screwed who tried to
Yeah.
use it for their legal cases, like the hallucinations and the random things. What is like, do we have an understanding yet of why those things happen, and what's gonna make it so that you aren't in Hong Kong thinking you're listening to the Chinese adaptation, but for 3 days it's been fully misinterpreting the audio it's hearing and telling you're walking around being like, I love having sex with strangers, and that's like, nope, that's not what you should be saying at all. Like what's gonna happen?
So, the somewhat glib answer to this is no one knows how the models work, right? And
Cool.
I know it's great. And so oftentimes, if a model is doing something and you don't want it to do, the best advice is, well, ask it more nicely in the prompt to not do that thing and hope it works. Or maybe threaten it
Amazing.
or coerce it in some way to try to, behave more directly. That's not,
So in that way, it is fully passing the Turing test, because at some point you right. Great.
yeah, it's getting very weird. There are some other approaches, right? And there's people doing really interesting work to try to understand how to control these types of behaviors. But am I doing that work? No, I'm trying things so
Sure.
that the model works well enough for my purpose.
Is that a proprietary thing? Are there people at OpenAI who understand this, or is this a weird thing where we built something called a neural net? We tried to replicate human intelligence a little, and we seem to have gotten good results from it, but no one understands what's going on inside the binary.
I think that's a good assumption. There are certainly people that understand it more, but yeah, these things they're not mechanistically understandable. You can't break it apart and say, oh, here we got this answer. We didn't like one part of it. Let's trace through the system and figure out where that part came from. No one can do that right now.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Couple of thoughts, go back to your example, Kevin, where it's spitting out random stuff. Like to some extent, like I'm going from zero on some of these use cases, right? Like speaking no Spanish, I'm willing to accept the 10% bad Spanish that it gives me occasionally, and I know 10% is kind of high, for it to give me the 90% good Spanish. So I actually think humans are going to be okay with those types of errors and hallucinations. The businesses might not be to be, but consumers?
You might not be if you're in China and it turns out the thing you're saying is Xi Jinping, likes to eat ass. Like, that's not going to be great for you walking down the street in China. Thailand probably doesn't like some of the stuff you would accidentally say out loud. So I don't know. The consumer application of that is not great either.
Interestingly, a machine learning model in Beijing just fired, and what you just said probably got captured. So well done.
Probably.
We're now
right.
on the radar.
Yep.
It's going to be glorious. Yeah.
It is very strange, and I think to your question of how does this impact regular machine learning models, right? Who Ooh, wow. Models, which are not people.
Until the Supreme Court rules otherwise.
Yeah, that's true. Models that are more understandable, right? That you actually can understand, what they're doing, and you can design them such that they don't do this. They are being replaced in to a certain extent. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for expediency, right? So there's often this big concern of, okay, we need a much smaller, more efficient model. Language models are really expensive. It's really hard to scale. So we need something cheaper to build. But then oftentimes the question comes in, okay, but how many people will have to work for how long to make the small model reach the same performance? And, it's X dollars, and we can spend half of that and just give it directly to OpenAI to do the thing. So it's like I understand the reason, like the business reason for why the language models and generative models, more broadly are just being used more and more often. It's not always because they perform better. They are less efficient. There's all these downsides, but sometimes the goal is we need to hit X% performance or accuracy or whatever. We need to do it in this amount of time, and this is our budget. And if all those things line up, it's hard just to argue against the business reason to just do that.
It feels like two mistakes we've made in the past. One, fortunately, more companies seem to be getting into this so that we do have a little bit more choice than we might have had in the past, where you just like get locked into a monopoly and all of a sudden OpenAI in 3 years is going to be able to just charge you whatever they want and
Mhm.
give you whatever answers are expedient to the, billionaires who secretly own that thing. But two, like, didn't we get into these patterns in the 90s? And that's why everybody hated the Visual Basic engineers who filled corporate backlogs with a bunch of just junk, because it was easier to go and get the quick turnaround out of the Visual Basic engineer than it was to have the C++ person build you the true system. And so are we also just repeating the same mistake in 5 years? We're going to have a bunch of chat GPT driven corporate intranet something or other, and we're going to be stuck with the 40% result that we got out of that because we made that budget decision in 2024.
I would be astonished if we didn't make that mistake.
Sure.
Yeah. Which goes back to what I've talked about in previous episodes, right? Like, I think through those mistakes, Visual Basic.net came along, right? Like,
Sure.
those challenges led to, hey, we got Visual Basic, we want to move to a more Java-esque language. Visual Basic.net was born as
Sure.
part of the .NET framework movement.
Right.
So I agree. I'd be surprised if we didn't make those mistakes, but we'll learn from some of them. And then the one thing that's interesting about it to me is how sticky it's all going to be. And this is why I always think, like, there's no turning back, right? If we're going 110 miles an hour, there will be either a brute force stop or someone's going to come in and say, hey, we have to slow down. But there really is no turning any of this stuff off in about 10 years, right? Because companies are going to be fully in bed with this paradigm of our customers use it, we use it internally. Like, this is sticky. It's never going away, right? So we have to solve the power problems.
Well, yeah. I mean, I feel like the thing we've now promised to people is sticky. The method we're using to implement it, I'm not convinced is sticky yet. Like, to David's point, if the answer is we hit a cap of we thought we could get to market quickly, and we set the expectation with our users that they're going to get this kind of result, but then we realized and we made the trade-off, we're only ever going to get to 70% good results, and now we're a much larger company with many more users, and they're getting frustrated with the 30%, and now we have to choose, are we going to invest in our own version of the model, which is more expensive, or hope that ChatGPT 6 gets us to that final 30%? Is a company going to wait around for OpenAI or Microsoft or Meta or whoever it is to get you that thing, or are they going to try to close the gap themselves? Because in 5 years, closing the gap is now hopefully maybe cheaper? I don't know. David, you had an interesting bullet point in here. Sell it first or build it first? Which drives better user adoption? I'm curious if you have like a specific scenario you've encountered where you run into somebody who didn't sell it to anybody and thought it was a great idea, and then you built it and spent a bunch of time, and then no one wanted to buy it? Or was it the other way around? A bunch of people sold stuff that people wanted, and then you were like, I can't possibly build that for you, or both?
I think the answer is probably many people have seen all sorts of examples of this. And, one of the reasons why I put it down is I think all these other trends are just accelerating this question, or accelerating this dichotomy in a sense, right? Because now the big risk of building it first was it took so long. You had to put so much effort and investment in to build it, and then just hope it sold or got engagement, or, fast enough growth or whatever. And depending on what the application is, right? If it's anything involving text or video or images or, pretty much anything, we're getting to the point. You can build it much quicker than you could in the past. Whether that's a bubble or not, I don't know. I'm not an economist. But it seems like that just gets easier, and it makes the question harder, right? If now it's no longer the question of a 6-month investment, but it's a 3-month investment or a 1-month investment, maybe you do just build it first and see what happens.
Right.
That's interesting. I guess that makes me think, going back to that point earlier about like 5 years in the AI world is not really 5 years anymore. Anybody who's been building sort of data science and AI platforms over before this, what I would call the golden era right now, the last couple of years, right? Do they ditch and just say, well, actually, we can build on much better now, much quicker, much cheaper than we could in the past with our old platform? Or do we take this now ancient platform that we built a few years ago and just modify it, right? So there's an interesting challenge for companies as to whether re-architect or just modernize what they built. But it's different. It's like dog and human years now, right? It's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that that's a good example of the second aspect. So let's say you don't want to build it first, right? You want to sell it first. You want to validate the concept, ensure there's actually a market for whatever it is you're building. You can do as much planning as you want, but if you're not building for a year, right? How are things going to change in that amount of time? There's absolutely stuff, that I built a couple of years ago that is completely obsolete. I wouldn't even want to use it now just because the approaches to do the same thing, they're going to have their own trade-offs, right? But the trade-offs are much better than the previous ones. So in that sense, yeah, in some ways, I don't know. This is where, ultimately I learned a lot from you, Kevin. This question of product management, trying to figure out what are we trying to do? Who are the users? What are the requirements? What is good enough? What defines an MVP? It seems like I'm appreciating that a lot more now, just because some of the things that were constant in the past, like, oh, if we wanted to do this, this is how we'd always do it, right? That's true now. That'll be true in a year. That isn't the case anymore.
Right.
So,
Well, yeah, that was good. It felt like it was going to lead into my question about exactly that. Product management seemed like when we were in that pre-LLM world of we needed to spend the time and really decide whether or not it was worth, we're going to have to find the data. We're going to have to pick the right models. We're going to have to chain 4 models together to get one question for the client. Like we had to, like, there was a reason I got brought in to do product management is because you didn't want to invest ahead of that curve. You had to validate that that was a thing that you wanted to do.
yeah.
And my other question for you was going to be, is that even mostly the world you're in? Like when you and I were working on stuff, agile and scrum ceremonies and all of that 2-week sprints, they didn't make sense for data science because of how you all work. Is that even a consideration? Are you all even needing to worry about, like, are you in sprints? Are you in any kind of framework, or are you just going and asking the questions of the models and saying, oh yeah, I think it's going to take me 3 weeks to do this thing, and you just get it done in 3 weeks?
So there's a bit of both still to a certain extent.
Okay.
But I think, the ability to put stuff into production faster to get something out there is really nice. And you can move quickly and validate, concepts and approaches. But then this is something that I think is still the case in a lot of ways. Just because you can get it into production doesn't mean that you can keep it in production or
Sure.
scale it, according to the schedule, that leadership wants to scale at. And so,
Right.
in practice, yeah, I am still working with lots of other teams. We do have cycles. They're not necessarily sprints, but they're largely similar, right? They're in the same way. We don't have a explicit agile process, but it's close. And ultimately, a lot of that is necessary, right? We have to have separate teams focused on doing different things. Just because I can show the prototype working by calling, the language model and it works fine, that's fine when there's one user, right? When there's multiple
Right.
users, you have to do load balancing across all the different API endpoints. You have to handle all of the failures that you're getting now. It's nice when you're running the model on your hardware, that's sitting on a computer in your building.
Right.
When you're not doing that anymore, there's all this other complexity that comes in. And then once you get it into the hands of actual users, right, all of the assumptions that you made, if they weren't done, with a skilled product manager who's trying to figure out what we're building, you're going to realize half of them were bad assumptions. Now you have to go rebuild stuff, and you have to do that in a way that's quick and doesn't take down the production application. So,
Right. So does it feel like you're closer to engineering now because the model development is less of the onerous and now you just need to figure out how do I get these results into engineers' hands? Is that a closer relationship than it was when we were working together?
that's certainly something I'm experiencing. Yeah. So I'm thinking much more about, what am I building? Can I give this to the engineers in a way that they can actually implement it, at
Right.
scale and in a way that's stable? But then, kind of on the other hand, and this is where the aspects of the work are getting less technical in a lot of ways, because I don't have to spend as much time building it. I'm thinking more or trying to think more about the users. What kind of features do they actually need? Will this be useful, or will it just be another feature that someone notices and then never uses? So trying to figure out, what's the impact of adding this feature? Is it actually going to be useful to people and drive value? And trying to get a better understanding of that question, because I know the implementation, will still take work. Obviously, it's not zero, but now it's more of a, okay, well, if we have the budget to make another call to the language model, I do some tests and I figure out, yeah, the model can do it. Do we want to do it?
Right. I think 4 years ago when we were working together, it definitely was a thing. I feel like I got better at working with you as I understood how data science works and how the machine models work, and it, like that relationship evolved. I am curious, is that still needed? Is it, if it's closer to engineering, are you able to work with any product manager, or does it still help to have a product manager who understands the underlying stuff that's happening with the machine learning?
I think it definitely still helps, right? Because those problems are easier in a lot of ways, and they've gotten simpler. And some I think are probably just gone, but the number of problems that are just gone is relatively small. It's the minority. Most of them just got a little bit easier. Some of them are ultimately still there, and so if you're trying to, often it's the questions of what do we want to build and why? What problem is it solving? And sometimes that actually is a data science question, right? You have to analyze the data to figure that out. You have to do stuff with the application to figure that out. And so then, having someone who understands, like, okay, we have this fundamental question, we have to do some testing, we have to do some analysis, right? We have to do some exploration. Maybe that's a sprint, maybe that's 3 sprints. Hard to say
Right.
until we start.
Right.
So,
Yep.
in that sense, yeah, I think it still does help.
And then I feel like this is something that you have to answer as a product person as well, but you've got your note here. Do you need better performing machine learning models or just better business processes or both? And I think like I face this in product all the time is like, is it worth the 7 sprints of engineering effort to add the one button that does a thing? Or should we just be figuring out why that's not the business process and the business process shouldn't just be better? So yeah, what are the things that you're running into that way?
I think there's kind of multiple sides of this, right? Sometimes it's on like product development or application development, and you're trying to figure out, do we need to build this whole system to do X, or is there another way to do X? And sometimes there is, right? But maybe the answer is equally unpalatable. Like if to do X you have to do a whole reorg, and no one wants to do a reorg, well then okay,
Hmm.
fine, just do it the other way, even though it'll take a
Right.
month of development. But then there's the other side of ultimately what are you trying to do, right? What is this feature for? Or you're trying to do some analysis of some data to get some business question, right, which is driving something else. And oftentimes the question is, well, how did it get to the point where we have to do this analysis? We need to analyze the data in some way to show some trend X. How do we not already know trend X? What led to that point? What are the organizational decisions that resulted in this situation? What are the other limitations that made it that we couldn't come to this conclusion in some other way? Is training a model or working with language model now and trying to figure out the best way to approach the problem that might be able to solve it? Yes. Do we want, to your point, this ties nicely back in earlier, do we want to now institute a new process that will be here for the next couple of years that works but has its own disadvantages? Or do we want to think about, okay, well, what is the underlying business process that failed that created this situation?
Well, and I think I don't remember what the name of the company was, but we were doing those like contract migrations from paper and PDFs into like an automated digital system. And it was a weird trade off of like the client's paying $250,000 to deal with the fact that their business process sucked and they weren't documenting the details of their contracts anywhere. And so at some point, is the $250,000 worth more than just like, oh, every once in a while some poor associate needs to go pull the PDF and answer the question. And then from now on, all new contracts will go into the automated digital system. But yeah, I'm always fascinated by the financial trade-off. And sometimes it does feel like a business person being like, well, I need all 20 years of contract data in my new contract management system. And it's like, okay, but you're paying $500,000 when what's really going to happen is over the next 5 years, you're going to pay $200,000 to the associates who need to spend 20 minutes getting you that answer. I don't know. It's weird business trade-offs.
Yeah, it is. And I think that that's one aspect of where there might be another break, on the speed at which a lot of this moves. Because, I still do this. I'm lacking some of the business experience, right? Because that's just not the pathway I chose. And, I may come into a problem and I'll see, oh, well, there's a quick solution here. We just need this team in this organization to talk to this team, and then this team has to change their process here. And, eventually someone will very patiently, sit with me and explain why all of that is actually impossible. Right.
Right.
And this is why we need to build this other approach, which is, yes, suboptimal, but it actually possible compared
Right.
to something
Yeah.
else. So even though we may be able to move a lot more quickly, there are other constraints on the types of systems that are actually implemented in practice.
All right, Greener, you want to ask your last AI question?
It's the one that I've refined my thinking on a little bit, though, right? That one, the controversial one.
Yeah, you highlighted it earlier. Is AI going to replace all of us eventually?
Yeah, so I'll refine it a little bit, which
Okay.
is no, let's ask it bluntly then, right? Like, is AI going to replace all of us eventually? No more work. We're living in a second renaissance period where we just focus on the things we want to focus on, and AI does everything else. Is that where we're heading?
In the sense that is inevitably where we're heading, or is that one of the potential outcomes?
Yeah, is it one of the potential outcomes? Because it's pretty extreme, right? If I tell somebody
Yeah.
who doesn't know AI and technology today that, they'd be like, "You're crazy." But if I say to a data scientist, they'd be like, "That is one of the potential outcomes," right?
Yeah, I think it has to be one of the potential outcomes in some limited sense, right? So it depends on the type of work we're talking about.
Yeah.
If I look at the stuff that I'm doing day to day, if the scaling trends continue, the technical part, at least, of my work is doable by these systems once they get good enough, right? And then even some of the non-technical stuff, although I don't fully understand org charts and all the complexities within that. Maybe a language model could. It feels like there's other constraints on the system at that point, but for a lot of the technical stuff, that does seem like one of the outcomes.
See, to me, it seems like the real solution is ChatGPT 4 today absolutely could replace at least half of CEOs. What CEOs do, I feel like we could just get out of large language models. So really, we're starting with the wrong job titles getting replaced.
Yeah, I knew you were gonna go there. I knew you'd go right to the top of the top of the pile. But it's
Do you know they asked OpenAI, they asked ChatGPT, could you do a CEO's job? And ChatGPT was like, yeah, of course.
Yeah,
Look,
okay.
this is what a CEO does. I can
Yeah.
do all of that.
but it's interesting because I just had to think about, and not picking on any listeners if this is your job day to day, because I'm saying we're all of us are going, right? I look at, somebody who's rifling through law books, right? Eventually looking for precedents in law, that goes away. And I get it, it's hallucinating today. I look at financial analysts and I say, well, actually, if I would probably trust AI in the future over the financial analyst, because the AI is making a decision on all the data or more data than the analyst is, and is not susceptible to the same human emotions, right? Of like, oh, I'm having a bad day, I'm not keeping my eye on the ball. So yeah, I can see a lot of professions where I'm like, I actually want AI to do that job. Now, here's the romantic side of me. I'm not completely cold and heartless. I want to live in a post-scarcity world where I can go paint pictures and play guitar all day and read, and AI is constantly perking up my IQ. So I kind of want to get there, but I think there's going to be some really bad years in between being here and getting to that post-scarcity world.
I am curious from a data science perspective, when you're looking at this technology, are you seeing like the leap from 3 to 4 and the pace that this all seems to be going? It does seem exponential, but it also feels like exponential at some point also becomes infinity. Like the line eventually just goes fully vertical, and that's not how anything ever works. Are there signs that you're seeing? Do we think GPT-6 is going to be a cap for a while, and the next thing we need to have is quantum computing before we like? Are you seeing anything in the industry that gives you pause that we're not 20 years away from that, we're 200 years away from that?
So, everyone has a different answer to this question.
Sure.
Certain people are much more qualified qualified to make their prediction. And I know this is a cop out, but I need to see GPT-5.
Sure.
That's going to be like the 500 million or $1 billion training run. It's going to be at the limit of what, the amount of data we currently have can support. It's going to be at the limit of, the GPUs that TSMC can produce, and it'll be close to the limit of, the data centers that we can power today. So if GPT-5 is another big leap, that's going to make me think like we're still going up. If it's underwhelming, and we'd have to realize like just getting the electricity to the data center to train GPT-6 is going to be a huge problem. That might make me think it's going to be a little bit slower.
We just need a Dyson sphere around the entire solar system to capture the sun's energy and could power the AI model. I mean,
Yeah.
that is the thing. I'm curious is at some point the problem is I have is like the billionaires who think that they can squeeze every last penny out of it don't seem to mind burning the equivalent of Guatemala's electric bill
Yeah.
every month and Sweden's electric bill to mine Bitcoin for some fucking reason. But at some point when it feels exponential, that line that goes vertical also is the power consumption line that goes vertical. And so if we think that the leap from 3 to 4 was whatever exponentially larger, and then yet 4 to 5 starts to plateau off, then 6 starts to run into that vertical wall at some point. And maybe the answer is they figured out how to do fusion, not fission. They figured out how to do quantum computing with Microsoft, although Microsoft's blue screen of death when the quantum state goes out of focus is going to be a question. But maybe there is like what we need is the next 10 years of hardware and power changes, and then the limit isn't in the actual AI technology. GPT-6 would be ready to go, but the problem is we need those other things to come into place first. So Greener, no one's necessarily trying to tell you no, but there do seem to be other limitations in there. You don't believe any of that's true. You think we're just going to burn through Mexico's power consumption and ChatGPT-6 will be great.
I see the same problems you do. I just don't know why you were picking up Microsoft, right? Like,
I was raised in Issaquah, next door to Redmond. I'm allowed. They're home.
That's fine. That's
the home
fine.
team.
Okay, you're picking on the family. I get it. Yeah,
Exactly.
No, I see the same limitations you do, but I feel like sometimes industries need motivations to tap into the next level. And I do look at quantum computing. I think when the two worlds meet, now we're next level, right? And remember, like, it's our job to survive as a species, and we haven't been doing a very good job for the last 100 years of sort of pulling in the same direction. So we need to stack the chips in our favor at some point. And I thoroughly believe when we get to that level of AI and quantum computing, the thing's going to turn around and say, yeah, I'm not working tomorrow until you guys stop being animals on this planet, because, I'm here to advise you to get to that next state of evolution, and you can't because you're your own worst enemy. I can't wait for that day when AI finally turns around and tells us we're our own worst enemy, right? So I do think we need that driver for alternative power, but I think we're going to do it. I'm super optimistic. I'm a fan of science, so we are going to do it.
What was the name of the old mainframe? Cerniac? Wasn't there some weird old mainframe that we used to be on? And like, it just feels like we were on like giant tapes. And yes, every year the giant tapes got smaller, but there still was a period from like 1940 to 1980 where that wasn't going fast enough. Like, I kind of feel like quantum computing, we're on the giant tapes. And yes, absolutely, it seems inevitable that there's a strong likelihood, although we don't understand how quantum science works as far as I can tell. So at some point, we're also just kind of like, I hope a boson doesn't show up and totally blow up the computer. But anyway, it does seem like that's my concern, is like quantum computing feels like we're in 1940 and it was only 40 years, but that's a 40-year delay in getting to GPT-6.
But that's 40 years in the old America, right? That's back when you worked 35 hours and you went home, and like kids will not be like that in the future. I feel like I know from my own career, right? It's a different America. Deregulation, like what is acceptable to release into production. I feel like we're going faster. So I feel like that 40 years is potentially 15, which happens in my lifetime, right? 20 years, whatever, still happens in my lifetime. I didn't think we'd get there in my lifetime. Like the last 2-3 years for me with XR technology, quantum computing, and now the AI sort of golden era kicking off, we're ahead of where I thought we were going to be.
I think the pace has been fast so far, and I think, at least in the United States, the deregulation is a big part of that. But that continued progress assumes the market will cooperate, right? So Meta just released all of their models, right? Their newest language models. They released them open source. They gave away the models. The stock dropped 15%. Right? Investors may not be happy, right? They already don't like Mark Zuckerberg, spending billions of dollars on this. When he comes back in a year and a half and says, "I want to spend 100 billion on this," will they continue cooperating? I don't know.
I mean, just last week, the NASDAQ contracted by like 15% because of a bunch of people anticipating. They haven't even announced. We haven't even gotten to quarterly results, but everyone assumed that the bets on AI were going to have negative impacts on the bottom line. So the stock market already started selling off a bunch of companies. So yeah, what happens when ChatGPT 5 is amazing and does really good stuff, but the margin is less, the whatever is less? Like,
it rains here in Florida too, right? Like it's gorgeous most of the time, but occasionally there's a rain cloud comes by. Like these are just speed bumps for me, right? Like we're going.
I want to see this last longer than like a couple of years. I'm not convinced that this isn't a bubble. Now, the dot-com bubble burst, and then they just created new dot-coms and did the exact same mistake again. So I'm not saying that it's not blocking progress, but I do think David's right. Like there's the speed of that progress can be hampered. Like you didn't get pets.com style investment and valuation again until the 2010s.
But even if it slows down, I still think we'll be in a place that's fundamentally different, and we'll start to question the current constructs to say, our investors, is the way investors think correctly? I know you're big on this with the billionaires and whether companies should be run the way they're run. I think I'd like to be in a period where we question those things too, right? Whereas if the bubble bursts and we get this period of calm where it's not quite a vertical line, it's like, it's aggressive. But I think we have to start questioning the current constructs too that we're in, where it's like investors, like, should they be making that much? Should they have that much say? I really think it's time for a change of the old mentality, right?
I mean, that goes back to my comments the other day about the fact that the Challenger explosion happened because NASA tried to think of itself as a public-facing company, basically, that needed to be beholden to Congress as shareholders and consumers as citizens is kind of not the way science should work. So, like, there is an argument in which, like, if there really is value and benefit to quantum computing improvements, AI computing improvements, then having it be tied to the whims of the stock market is bad, actually, but that is how we've operated for the last 40 years. So I'm not sure a lull in the stock market is going to do anything other than turn investors off of AI for a couple of years. I'm not sure it's going to be the shock to the system.
Yeah.
Also, should we just conclude with the fact that artificial intelligence is a nonsense word that doesn't mean anything? Nothing we've done is actual artificial intelligence. The closest I feel like I've seen is in Mass Effect, they referred to it as virtual intelligence because it wasn't artificial, it wasn't actual consciousness, it was like a Siri, basically. Like, we don't actually have any AI as far as I can tell.
Well, actually, I don't disagree. I think we're in complete agreement there, but I might actually state, based on some of the X users that I come across these days, maybe we should just call it intelligence, because this is my point, is it's not really artificial intelligence when it stacks up against us in another 40 years. It will just be intelligence, right? And we'll be the inferior intelligence.
Sure, but we're not quite there yet. It doesn't quite pass the Turing test.
I think sometimes, and this might be a slightly contrarian view, I think it depends on more what you're asking the model to do and how you use the output. That determines whether is this just statistics, is this just a simple ML model that you fully understand, or are you actually using the model to do something that is, in a sense, relying on its intelligence.
Interesting.
So I do this, from day to day. I will give the model a task. I can describe what the task is. I know what I want the output to look like. I could not describe a traditional model or a completely explainable way to do this thing. I take the output that the model gives. If it looks fine, I use it. Right? I'm assuming the model is intelligent.
Beginning of utopia.
Oh, Lord.
I'm not saying it's a good thing that I'm doing. I'm just saying what I do.
No, but that's the kind of thing I think we've had like some debates on this show about. I am fully on board with the idea that seems like a good use. I don't love that it's probably based on theft. I wish they'd done that part a little bit better, but I'm not mad at the idea of like this thing that is highly intelligent being able to help a bunch of us so that we're spending time doing the more valuable thing than doing the sort of grunt work side of the world. I love that part of the AI part of it. What I don't love is the idea that it's not actual consciousness, so please stop trying to replace artists. It's not actual consciousness.
Yes, that's a whole separate question.
Right, exactly. And it's not actual consciousness, so please stop trying to replace employees. What you should be doing is making those people more effective at the job you have them doing, and maybe even broadening the concept of what their job is. But I just don't love that it's right now being used to just slash entire industries because we think the ChatGPT model can replace the tech support person. It very clearly can't. And I'm not holding up tech support people necessarily in every call center in the world. Don't do the most amazing job, but those are still human beings who I would rather have a person involved most of the time than an unthinking bot that is sometimes speaking to me in Spanish because on Tuesdays ChatGPT gets weird.
And this is where we fundamentally disagree, because
Yes.
Kevin's stacking AI art up against artists, and I'm saying that's a minority. But when it makes the rest of the world that don't believe they can paint and take a photograph and play a guitar and sing, when AI starts to include all of them and allow them to be artists and realize they are actually artists, that's a beautiful thing. So you want to protect the 150 decent artists on the planet, 150,000 decent artists on the planet. And I'm telling you, I want to unlock the 7.999 billion%, like a billion people who don't believe they can be artists. Let AI help them to become artists.
And there's two parts about that. One, all of those models are based on stealing the 150,000 people's art and not compensating them for it. So I have a problem with the fundamental technology. Solve that, make it an actual consciousness that does what human beings do and interprets other things that no. So
Stealing,
we're not there yet.
That's
and two, we're not at post-scarcity. So I would rather we still let the 150,000, and it's more than 150,000 by the way, but I would like that relative minority to still get paid for jobs. And sure, in a post-scarcity world, can we all become artists? Great. But for right now, we should reward the people who put in the 10,000 hours, just like we reward the engineers who put the 10,000 hours. Like we over-reward the CEO who put the 10,000 hours. But everyone right now in a capitalist system deserves reward for the effort they're putting in, and you're bypassing that system. And I'm saying no, not until we get past the capitalist system.
Kevin says no. Stealing is a very harsh term.
It's 100% theft.
You put it out on the airwaves. It's open source.
No, we're not having that debate again. We're gonna let David go to sleep. All right. Anything else we want to chat about?
No, I don't know whose side he's on.
David is a perfect cipher. Like he shares his opinion when he doesn't want to rock the boat, but David wants to get employed in the future. David doesn't want to say anything that's going to risk that.
I am benefiting from all the technology, and I am intentionally avoiding all the hard questions. It's certainly easy for me, but it's hard to defend as a strong stance.
All right, cool. Well, this has been an awesome discussion. Thank you, David, for coming and doing this with us.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, thank you, David. And actually, Kevin, like you should invite David back for a reoccurring if there's anything in the future. So the invite, you're always welcome to come back.
I may take you up on that. This was really fun.
All right, well, that's going to do it for us on this episode of Acceptance Criteria. If you liked what you heard, maybe go and drop 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and leave us a nice review. And if you didn't like what you heard, remember the name of the podcast is Jordan Jesse Go. Also tell your friends if you like the show and that they should check it out. Some of the best podcasts out there grow by word of mouth, and we'd much appreciate it. To read articles we've written on similar topics to the ones we talked about here, head over to the blog at acceptancepod.com. You can also follow us on most apps. We're at AcceptancePod. We'll post links to show notes and any articles from the blog over there. We're also building a community on Reddit at r/acceptancecriteria and on Discord. You can find links to both in the show notes and on the blog. And I promise we'll be moderating the crap out of them to keep it a nice little slice of the internet. For now, I'm Kevin Thomas Euland, and you can find me on most apps at kthomaseuland. That's ULLAND.
And I'm Andrew Greener. You can find me on most apps at Criteria Greener. That's GREINER. And this has been Acceptance Criteria. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you.